paragraphs to go, but they all have gotchas in them pretty much. So it's anyway. Okay, we made it online now. So just put a message in. Okay. And let's see. All right, I can do without that for the moment. So good morning out there in YouTube land. It's nice to have you here. We are going to begin our reading of Answer to Job momentarily. And in the email that I sent you today, if you received it, which you would have only received it in the last 5 minutes, it contains an announcement about our Wisdom Path session this afternoon, which is going to be quite an important session. It's on this book, Reflections of a Passerby, and the subtitle is Jesus, Jung, and the Power of Choice by Eleanor Norris. And I found this to be a very powerful book, and I immediately wanted to invite Dr. Norris to speak with us. And so she will be doing that this afternoon at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, 6 p.m. Mountain Time, 5 p.m. I'm sorry, 6 p.m. Central Time, 5 p.m. Mountain Time, and 4 p.m. U.S. California time. It will be late for our friends in Europe and around the world, but it will be an important session, so I hope you can join us. So I'm going to move right along into Answer to Job. This is among my favorite sections. In fact, the very next paragraph, 746, is one of my two favorite sections because I had a numinous experience when I read Answer to Job the last time, and I'll describe that. But let me go on with paragraph 745 first. And basically, I put in my notes on my copy of the book the words "grow up." This is Jung's statement that we have to grow up and start acting like responsible adults. And so here I will read it. Everything now depends on man. Immense power of destruction is given into his hand, and the question is whether he can resist the will to use it and can temper his will with the spirit of love and wisdom. He will hardly be capable of doing so on his own unaided resources. He needs the help of an advocate in heaven, that is, of the child who was caught up to God and who brings the healing and making whole of the hitherto fragmentary man. Whatever man's wholeness or the self may mean per se, empirically it is an image of the goal of life spontaneously produced by the unconscious, irrespective of the wishes and fears of the conscious mind. It stands for the goal of the total person, for the realization of their wholeness and individuality with or without the consent of their will. The dynamic of this process is instinct, which ensures that everything which belongs to an individual's life shall enter into it, whether they consent or not, or is conscious of what is happening to them or not. Obviously, it makes a great deal of difference subjectively, whether he knows what he is living out, whether he understands what he is doing, and whether he accepts responsibility for what he proposes to do or has done. The difference between conscious realization and the lack of it has been roundly formulated in the saying of Christ already quoted. Man, if indeed thou knowest what thou doest, thou art blessed. But if thou knowest not, thou art cursed and a transgressor of the law. Before the bar of nature and fate, unconsciousness is never accepted as an excuse. On the contrary, there are very severe penalties for it. Hence, all unconscious nature belongs to the light of consciousness, while frantically struggling against it at the same time. So, this is a very, we'll call it a pregnant paragraph. Yeah, the point is that the point that Dr. Jung made in one of his videos that is on YouTube, where he said, humanity lives by a thin thread, and that is the psyche of man. And if we don't control that thin thread, it will break and we will all die. That is, proven by science now. Between 23 and 100 nuclear weapons detonated in the atmosphere, and all life on Earth will end. And that's really not a very good outcome. And so we have to wake up. We have to be fully conscious. Now, what does that mean? Well, do you think you're conscious? Just ask yourself now, do you think you're conscious? And if you think that consciousness is your five senses, hearing, seeing, tasting, touch, sight, sound, taste, touch. I don't know if I got the five, but anyway, if you think that's consciousness, then you're profoundly wrong, because there is so much more to life. And this is what education brings us at every level, which is to make us more conscious, more aware of the world around us. Because if we aren't aware of the world around us, we will die one way or another, and it might not be pretty. And so every minute of education that you get adds to your consciousness of how things are, how things were, how things have been, and how things might be in the future. And if you're not conscious of those things, then you're just a shuttlecock being bounced back and forth by various forces. And so everything depends on having as many people as possible, as conscious as possible. And if you see a person in their home library and they're surrounded by books, yes, those books are dead. They're not physically alive. However, they represent a consciousness that person may have within themselves. And but we have to understand that we live our lives in the eros, not in the logos. The logos is all those books. Those are dead. They are not alive. Only we are alive, and only living things like plants and pets and that sort of thing, and other animals. But everything else is just rock in essence. And so we can heal. Now, here's the thing. None of us, we all make mistakes, and none of us have any power to heal ourselves from those mistakes necessarily. Sometimes we can, but we always need the help of others often. And sometimes that help can come from our parents, who give us a perspective, often our mothers, because our fathers are out doing something else. And they give us a perspective. Then later on, we have friends, or we can meet somebody for tea or coffee and talk over our problems and get a perspective on those. If we're drawn toward finding out in our unconscious, we might go to a divination method. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be the tarot, it could be astrology, it could be reading tea or coffee leaves or coffee grounds. I had a reading that way once, and it was uncannily and scarily accurate, unfortunately. So sometimes you don't want to know, maybe. But if you do want to know and you bring it into your life, then at least you can work with it. And so what psychotherapists and psychologists are doing, all psychologists are essentially doing this, which is making you aware of some aspect of yourself that you may not be thinking about. And they, through their study to become a psychologist, know a lot. They don't necessarily know everything, but they know a lot. And then you have psychiatrists. Now, psychiatrists can serve that role too, but psychiatrists are certified to give prescriptions for medications. And if there's actually a mental disease or defect in the brain or in the psyche of an individual, then modern medicine has come up with ways to ameliorate that through a medication. And so psychiatrists are the one that can write prescriptions. Then we have a lot of people who go out and get their own pharmaceuticals one way or another. And those are, they can be helpful to some people. However, it's very dangerous, and it's certainly dangerous to acquire them outside of normal health programs, because you don't know, or pharmaceutical programs with your druggist, because if you do, you just don't know what you're getting. You don't know how it's been cut. You don't know how it's been mixed. You just don't know what you're getting. And as we know, well, at least I know in 2019, the number was we killed 70,000 people in the United States due to fentanyl and other illicit drugs. So if you're buying drugs illicitly, then you're just taking your life in your hands right then. And good morning or good afternoon, Danny. Glad Europe could make it today. And good morning, Patrick. Nice to see you. Okay, so that's sort of what I wanted to do as an opening homily, and I'm expecting Jordan to join us, but in his absence, I will be giving a soliloquy, and I do have a person here on the panel, but that person chooses to not be visible, so I have to carry the load. So another thing another thing that I want to bring to your attention in this paragraph is this logion, which is Christ meet a man who's working on the Sabbath, and here's what he says to him, and it's from the Codex Bezae, and it's not a part of the Bible, and it's an apocryphal insertion at Luke 6:4. Luke 6:4. Okay, and here's what he says. Man, if indeed thou knowest what thou doest, thou art blessed. But if thou knowest not, thou art cursed and a transgressor of the law. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, he means that civilization is developed with laws, for example, and those laws are designed to protect us if we follow them, and most of the time they do protect us. But it's possible to violate a law now and again. I think most of us probably have speeded at one point or another in our driving career, for example. And so what he's saying here is that better minds than you have figured out what speed is the best speed for that particular stretch of highway. But if you know that you're violating that speed, then you know two things. One, you may know, or this is what he hopes you know, that there are good reasons to go faster. I remember when my first wife was getting ready to have our first child, and she was 6 months pregnant and began to bleed. I put her in the car and I sped to the hospital as fast as I could. I didn't feel I could even wait for an ambulance to come. And I went through a number of intersections at 55 miles an hour without paying attention to stop signs and so on. And I knew what I was doing, and it worked out. I got her to the hospital, and the doctors were able to have her keep the baby for another month, which saved her life. And she's now 47 years old, thankfully. And so I knew I was violating the law. I knew I was risking not only my life, my wife's life, but other drivers' lives. But in that circumstance, I felt it was worth doing. And so another point about driving is that when we're going down the highway, you can see this especially at night, that the headlights are coming toward you and the tail lights going away from you. And you can see those, but you don't know anything else about that highway, except maybe that you're on either a superhighway, probably a superhighway in that circumstance. And you are totally reliant on every other person that's driving a vehicle, whether they're a good driver or a bad driver. And also you're reliant on the regulatory authorities that set up speed limits and put up other warning signs and that sort of thing. That's all civilization and rules. But in the end, you have no idea who those people are. It's completely dark outside of this line of traffic in both directions. And you have no idea whether the other people in the other cars, the drivers, are are good drivers or bad drivers, whether they're driving while impaired or whatever. You're just entirely dependent on the collective unconscious at that time. And so this is what I think Christ was referring to. This logion, as I say, appeared in the Codex Bizet, and I believe it's also part of the Apocryphal in the Gospel of Thomas. Okay. So now we get, let me just see if I can. Wait a minute. Okay, I'm going to read through some of your chat messages. Kathy says, I agree that carefully chosen paths with professional support and expertise is super wise, and the dangers all around the spectrum. We must be discerning. Absolutely true. The bottom line, misappropriated drug use is dangerous. Absolutely. Danny says, you said the Bible and Christ are true. Guess you didn't mean that in a literal way. I think it's more logical to assume ancient people invented stories and characters to express ideas. Well, the Bible is almost certainly totally untrue in the physical world, because even to the extent that it reports historical events, the chances of those historical events being accurate are basically zilch and nil, because there was no historical tradition, especially in most of the Old Testament, and even after the time of Christ. The Bible was settled on in 325 AD, so that's 325 years after the time of Christ. And so what do you remember from 325 years ago that you can write down and be sure is 100% correct? And the answer is probably nothing. And so the fathers of the church, and they were all fathers at that point, or well, maybe they weren't fathers because they were priests, but those guys that met in the Council of Nicaea basically had to decide what to accept and what to not accept of ancient teachings. And even the ancient teachings were written down. I believe the earliest of the Gospels was written down about 80 years after Christ's death. So did the scribes who wrote down those Gospels, did they have direct knowledge and experience with the time of Christ? Almost not. Okay. However, if we look, so in a physical sense, in the logical, rational sense, it's almost certainly true that none of the Bible is true in the physical sense, but in the psychological sense, in the psyche, which is the only part of the psyche that I ever talk about, or, the only sense I talk about is the irrational and the psyche. It's 100% true because it's been passed down from generation to generation, and what is true falls away, but what isn't true, or what isn't true falls away, but what is true to the psyche, to the meaning of the psyche, that stays and gains support, It's you could think of it as something like a fairy tale, where a fairy tale is told by some old grandmother somewhere the first time, maybe, and somebody hears it and it resonates with their unconscious, so they tell the story again. But inevitably, like the old telephone game, the parts that are true get carried forward. The parts that weren't true get amended in some way, or they get dropped off. And so this is, the power of fairy tales, which is they are true. And the older they are, the more, the stronger they are in terms of the psyche, because they teach us a lesson. Now, for modern individuals like you and me, maybe our fairy tales are movies, for example, or television programs, but especially movies. In my case, I've probably seen at least 3,000 movies, and there are some movies that truly resonate with me very deeply. I watch them multiple times. I can recite major parts of their dialogue because they are so important. And almost always, whenever I have a major issue coming up in my life, I will get a vision of a specific scene in a specific movie. And that will be instructive to me. Okay. And so that's how I learned, to the extent I have any wisdom, it probably came from those. Two that are favorites of mine are Patton and Gandhi. And the reason is that Patton deals with the times that we need to press forward and be strong in a physical way. Gandhi represents a time when we need to yield and be like water around stones. Sometimes we have to be the stone, and sometimes we have to be the water. And I often get any number of references that come to my mind. The images from those movies flash into my head. Now, after 9/11, well, people started to get onto this. Hollywood directors started getting onto Jung in maybe the 60s or 50s, and some of them really play the archetype card very heavily. For example, the Star Wars series basically is repeating the same archetypes over and over again. They are somehow repeated in 9 different movies. But there's always an anima figure, whether it's Princess Leia or Rey, who's in the later movies, or it's Anakin Skywalker's mother is one too. But in any case, they are communicating with us at an unconscious level. They're reinforcing the hero's journey, which is always with us, but it may have become too much, okay, in the sense that we now have to see, and we will be seeing over the next months and years, how smart humanity has become, because we're going to see what happens with the Commonwealth nations, whether they move away from reference to the constitutional monarchy, or they stick with it. Now, in my view, what they should be doing is staying with it, because what is it? It is a symbol of the unity of the human family. Very simply, not the United Kingdom, but the monarchy. What Queen Elizabeth II represented is a symbol of the unity of the human family. And if you don't believe that, all you have to do is consider your own heart and what you felt about her death. Okay, I'm quite moved when I start to talk about it, and so I know that she was an important symbol in my life in many ways, at many times. There was a time when I was a child that I thought she looked like my grandmother, and she actually was born in the same year as my mother. She was 3 months older than my mother. And so I've been following the developments of her life ever since I was a little boy. And, you know, leaving aside what the Americans did in the Revolution, which was probably the right thing to do at that time, we didn't leave behind the symbol, okay? And whether you're part of the Commonwealth of Nations or not, if you felt anything at the death of Queen Elizabeth, if you feel anything in watching if you have any emotion whatsoever, good or bad, any emotion whatsoever, in connection with her funeral and the ceremonies that lead up to it, then you are affected. She is a symbol to you of something that is relevant to your life. Okay, now, King Charles III has a really serious responsibility, because he has to work through what that symbol means, especially to people who are outside of the United Kingdom. I watched the accession of King Charles III in Canada the other day, and you know, the Governor General of Canada, who is the representative of the monarchy, was signing paperwork that pledged the loyalty of Canada to the crown. And Justin Trudeau was sitting there, and he looked like a little boy who was about to burst. And so we may see that there may be a referendum in Canada to pull away from looking to the British crown. But the idea has never been that the British monarchy ruled Canada truly. It was always a symbol of something larger. And if they pull away, or if Australia or if New Zealand pulls away, or any of these Caribbean countries, that will mean that the humanity in those realms has not grown up enough to realize that we're all in the same boat, and it's a pale blue dot out there in space, and we need symbols of our commonality, which is what the Commonwealth is. The United States is not part of the Commonwealth, and yet I imagine that most Americans will have an emotional attachment to Queen Elizabeth. It may be a dark side attachment, and therefore a poof. You know, we got rid of kings, but you know, I think we could do with a little bit of understanding of what that represented, because in the United States, how do we put emphasis on the word united when we're so pulling so strongly to the left and the right? How do we show our unity as fellow human beings and as humans without a symbol like that? Okay, so we do have a symbol like that, actually, but it's not a living person. It's a living document in the form of the Constitution. And as long as we respect that document, then we can stay united. But if we cannot respect that document, then we fall apart into warring gangs and attitudes, and we never are united. Now, today happens to be 9/11, and so I was watching the commemoratives on television before I came in here, and all of us who were alive at that time know that at that moment, the United States became totally united. The flags flew off the shelves of any store that was selling flags. People had them on their cars going down the road, so every 5th or 10th car had a flag flying and out in the wind, and we were all united, and we wanted to know, what are we going to do? Okay. And as Senator Hillary Clinton said at that time, you know, on the day, we are all behind President Bush at that time, you know, and we will do what needs to be done. And she recounted that 2 days later, she was in the Oval Office with the president, and he said to her, she was the senator from New York at that time, he said to her, what do you need? And she said, well, we need $20 billion to rebuild New York. And he said, you shall have it. And he was good to his word. So that's the unity that we're looking for in the world. The US has offered one beacon of that unity of the human species, and therefore we have people we call Americans who come from every national origin, every religion, every culture, anywhere on earth. They are all here, and they can all call themselves American. And that unity does exist in the Commonwealth. Now, the question is whether sophomoric leaders will try to pull out of that unity. If they do, then we haven't grown up enough. And as I said at the beginning of this paragraph, this is Dr. Jung's call to grow up as human beings and recognize that we're all in that same pale blue dot floating out there in space, and we have to wake up. So with that, I will go back and read some of your comments here. I hope I answered your question, Danny. Yeah. And Kathy says all that in the respectful spirit of a balanced discussion. Absolutely. And then Kathy says, Skip, what are your top 3 favorite go-to movies? Oh my goodness, there's so many, Kathy. What I was referring to on Patton and Gandhi were movies that back in the 80s, when I was in Japan in the early 80s. But, you know, there have been so many, and you have to, we have to just discern for ourselves which ones pop up in our own minds. Because those are your go-to movies. I mean, whether you, I mean, those 2 movies represent from the Kabbalah the pillar of mercy and the pillar of severity. Okay, in the Kabbalah, and so if you go to those 2 movies, you will get a huge amount of wisdom. But there are many others. There's The Bridge Over the River Kwai, for example, which is a movie about prisoners of war in Burma during World War II. And it's a movie about basically about perseverance and what it takes to be a leader. And when Colonel Nicholson comes out of the box, he's being held in a heat box in a very hot climate, and he's near death. And he goes into the Japanese colonel's office, and the colonel offers him a drink, and a drink of sake, and the colonel says, well, if I can't get your troops to work on the bridge that I'm supposed to build, I shall have to commit suicide. And Colonel Nicholson picks up the sake and says, well, I'll drink to that. Boom. But then he goes to his own officers, and he points out that the troops, the British troops, have been sort of working at building a bridge, but it keeps falling down. And he goes to some of his officers who are engineers and tells them that he wants to build a proper bridge, a bridge that they can be proud of. And so they began, so up until that time, his surviving troops are a kind of rabble, but once they get their minds around the idea of civilization and building a proper bridge and making a memorial to themselves and what they had done, they really get into it and they build the bridge. Now, the problem is that at the end, Colonel Nicholson loses the point at the end, which is that he, in building a proper bridge, he has helped his enemy resupply their armies. And meanwhile, British commandos are coming in. They know the bridge is going up, and they set up explosives on the bridge. And he gets very indignant that the bridge is going to get blown up. And it's only when he is shot and he's dying that he says, "What have I done?" And he dies onto the plunger that causes the explosion to take place, and the Japanese train goes into the River Kwai. So it's a very meaningful movie. That's a very meaningful one to me as a former military person, because we have to maintain discipline, the law and order, but we also have to let men blow off steam. So it's very common on Friday nights at the clubs, the enlisted clubs, especially in the Marine Corps, for there actually to be fistfights among men, just because that happens. And to a degree, that has to be allowed. But the way I came upon it was I had to serve as the junior officer of the day at Quantico Marine Base one day. And what the Marine Corps does is at closing time, they bring all the MPs at the enlisted club just to show force, and everybody goes home and back to their barracks where they can sleep it off. And so, management and leadership are difficult issues, and I often get guidance from many things. I get lots of guidance from the work of C.G. Jung, of course. I don't know, you kicked off. So anyway, let's see, another favorite it's an old movie, so it's a little bit of a giggle in terms of its early 1940s quality, is a movie called Mrs. Miniver. And what that movie is about is the time when Churchill and the Admiralty get all the small boat owners in Britain, on the eastern coast of Britain, to go across the channel and pick up the British Army from Dunkirk, because there were 300,000 or 400,000 men on the beach at Dunkirk, and they were in the process of being annihilated in 1940. And Mrs. Miniver and the people around her, she's in a small village in Britain, organized to go, they're asked by Churchill and the Admiralty to go pull the men off the beach, and that's what they do. And they work a miracle, which is to save the army for another day. So, you can take lessons from so many movies. I mean, you can take lessons from The King and I, which is a beautiful musical with Yul Brynner, and I think it's Deborah Kerr in that case. Yul Brynner plays the monarch, and who has the responsibility of keeping his country together at the time that and there is still a king in Thailand to this day. That's Thailand. But anyway, it was a beloved stage show on Broadway for years. I think it was on Broadway 20 years, perhaps. Anyway, and a movie was made of it. Let's see. Jan says, interesting, our dependence of the goodness of the system and of strangers alike. The magical element is in the perception of it, and the reflection on it will lead to gratitude. Absolutely. And I was just reading about that in the Black Books this morning. I can't tell you how important it is. Danny says, still buy a Star Wars figure sometimes, was into Star Wars since the 80s. Yep, sure. The Star Wars are our hero story in our generations. And now there are new heroes, but we all need those. And Kathy says, I bawled like a baby when Queen Elizabeth died. And, I certainly wept. I didn't bawl like a baby, but I'll tell you when I did bawl like a baby, and that was when Notre Dame burned. And that Notre Dame, too, is a symbol. Um, I am not a Catholic, never have been a Catholic. But when I came in from an errand outside and I turned on the television and I saw Notre Dame actively burning, I wept uncontrollably for about 15 minutes. And so I had to reevaluate my position. And what was it about Notre Dame that caused me to be so emotional about it? And I did come to the understanding within myself that it was about the spiritual life. And the irony is that, the fathers of the church were although Notre Dame has always been a tourist attraction, before that fire, the fathers of the church were unable to get the French public to contribute $1 million to the upkeep of the church. But after the fire, the French government committed $1 billion, $1,000 more, to the rebuilding of Notre Dame. And, you can say, okay, there was money involved, and they knew that Notre Dame was a big tourist attraction. And of course, that's true, but it's much, much deeper than that. And it's a symbol throughout the world. No matter what cathedral you may have in your community, and I have the Cathedral of the Navy just 2 miles from my house here, the chapel of the U.S. Naval Academy. And it too is built like a traditional medieval cathedral. And what is it that kept people building on cathedrals for 100 years? Okay, there's the Gaudi Cathedral in Spain, the Sangria de Familia, or whatever it's called. I'm not sure in Spanish, but it's known as the Gaudi Cathedral. That has been being built for over 100 years now. The Cathedral of Washington took 100 years. So what was it in medieval times, in the 12th and 13th centuries, when Chartres was built, that caused people who were dirt poor? I mean, these were people that were eking out a living on a cow and a few goats around castles where there were strongmen. What was it that kept them working on the cathedral? Okay, and very simply, it was hope. One of the issues that I'm currently addressing with some very sensible people is an issue that came to my attention during the Vietnam War. I was at a combat base that had 5,000 Marines on it. I was an interrogation officer, and I was one of the officers that was responsible for the prisoner of war camp. So I was an intelligence officer. And in that role, and by the way, this was long before attitudes like Abu Ghraib ever came up. We were still believing in the Geneva Convention in those days. But leaving that aside, one of my duties was to go every day to the colonel's morning brief and brief the colonel on what was going on in in this intelligence arena that we had. And so there were, as I said, there were 5,000 Marines on this base. And every Monday, the chaplain, who was a Navy commander, would stand up and say, well, Colonel, yesterday we had either 11 or 12 worshipers in chapel, 11 or 12 out of 5,000. Just think of that, and think of the old traditional saying that there are no atheists in foxholes. And so at the time, I just took it as a data point. I didn't know what to do with that data point. But lately, it's reawakened in me. It's worked in my unconscious those 50 years since then. And so I started to think about the spiritual malaise of society. And I asked myself, it never occurred to me in my 9 months in Vietnam to go to chapel, not once. And the chaplain had a perfectly nice chapel. It was on the top of this hill. It had this beautiful commanding view of the South China Sea. It had, in the chaplain's kit, they had stained glass saran wrap that they would put up over the gun ports of the bunker. So it was built as a bunker with gun ports, but then the chaplain would put this stained glass saran wrap over the opening so it looked like a church. And so it wasn't awful. And I didn't even learn that it was up there until I started going to those briefings, actually. And I never once saw the chaplain, never took any interest in anybody that I knew of. And so I was thinking about spiritual malaise, and I've had to evaluate what kept me together spiritually during that period. For me, I was there for 6 months, and it finally came to me that what kept us going spiritually at that time was hope. Okay, every man who was on that base had a short timers calendar. I didn't keep one physically, but I kept one in my psyche, where I knew exactly how much time I had left to spend in Vietnam. But most everyone had some sort of short timers catalog, so they could tick off the days that they had left before they could go back to the world. There's an old saw about the Marines, that a Marine is reporting to St. Peter in heaven, and he says, "Just one more Marine reporting, sir. I've served my time in hell." And that's why you rarely get a soldier or a sailor who returns from battle who ever speaks to his family about what went on while he was there. And so there were several other things that kept my spirit high. One was looking forward to seeing the Bob Hope show, because I had seen that. And, Bob Hope's name was perfect for this. He started doing USO tours during World War II, and he probably selected Hope as a nom de plume during the war. I don't think that was his original given family name, but I don't know that for sure. But in any case, the hope of going to the show, after I had seen it a number of times on television, in documentaries that they were putting on TV in those days, So I wanted to go and see it in real life. And when the time came and his tour came to Da Nang, I didn't get to go see it. And I was not one of the ones selected to go see it. And, that really had me down. My spirit was crushed because of that. And shortly after that, within a week or two of finding out that I wasn't going to get to go, I became desperately ill. I had dysentery. I had 104 temperature. I was medevaced and ended up in the hospital, lost 17 pounds during that time. But I got to go to the Bob Hope show, and I was one of the hospital people in the blue uniform who was sitting down in front during the Bob Hope show. And, that made my spirits soar. Okay. And the other thing was the prospect of R&R after 6 months and being able to go see my wife someplace outside of the war zone. And again, my spirit was crushed when the original date for my R&R was postponed 3 months. So I didn't get to go to R&R for 9 months from the beginning of my tour. And it turned out to be only 3 weeks before I came back from Vietnam. And, it was grand when we got to do it, but when I found out in January that I wasn't going to be able to go in January, I was totally crushed. And my wife, I think, was within a day of getting on an airplane and flying to Hong Kong. So it was a huge crushing event for us from a spiritual point of view. So anyway, that I digress though. So let's see. So Danny says, no disrespect, but the Queen isn't above common people. I cry when family members dies, but not for the Queen. Well, okay, Danny, she isn't a symbol for you, but that doesn't mean she's not a symbol for, I would say, a majority of the world's population, which is why it's going to be on our television. Her funeral will be on our televisions pretty much everywhere in the world for the next 10 days. And Danny says he saw the bridge over the River Kwai. Kathy, could the lack of attendance at chapel be due partially to fear of contrasting emotions? I can only imagine that faith is more important than ever, and yet the internal concern of heart softening and not being able to perform duties is a curiosity for me. If that was a concern, it had to be unconscious. I wouldn't have thought that at the time. Arguably, that's true. It can also be that we had to take malaria pills once a week. And after we had been in Vietnam for 4 weeks, when we took our 5th malaria pill, they laid us low. We got deathly ill every week on Sunday when we had to take that pill. And so it could have been that too, and that would have been a physical reason why people didn't get to go to chapel. But I'm only speculating. And she says, Danny, sorry, but disrespect taken, slow down. Please, I didn't say she was above anything. You don't know me. You have no idea as to my deep personal losses. My tears are not up to judgment. Surely, that's a fair enough point, Kathy. And each of us takes it as it comes to us. As I say, I didn't know why I wept when Notre Dame burned, because I'm not a Catholic. And the reason I'm an American is because of a religious war between the Catholics and the Protestants. That was the 80 Years' War between Holland and Spain. And every year, the Catholic Spanish would come to Holland to try to force the Calvinist Dutch into being Catholic again. And every year, the Dutch would, after the harvest, would flood their country, and the Spanish would go back to sunny Spain for the winter. But this went on for 80 years until the Treaty of Westphalia. But my ancestors, that was 1648, but my ancestors came to New Amsterdam, now New York City, in 1625. They came on a leaky boat and they left their whole life behind them. A lot of history there, but religions have been used as bludgeons across the world, and it's a problem. It's a problem that pastors, if they're somewhat liberal, think of the religious world as a circle in which each religion has a pie piece, and they say, well, all religions point back to the same things. Well, okay, but they think of that as the spiritual world, but that is not what holds us together spiritually. Religions are very important from a psychological point of view, and Dr. Jung definitely recognized that. He never tried to denigrate any religion, and he said something like religions are psychological support on the grandest scale, and their symbols are grand symbols of the psyche, blah blah blah. And I think that's in either volume 10 or 11, probably 11 of the collected works. But so he said that all religions are important because they hold people together, etc. But what I have come to realize, because my own experience in Vietnam, is that our spirit isn't only supported by religion. Okay, religion is one piece of it, but another piece is our family. Another piece may be being effective in sporting events, right? Either actually having an authentic life, being down on the field with the players, or vicariously by being a fan. In either way, it is a kind of support. I'll stop there because I want to get into these next two paragraphs. Also very important, and these are the paragraphs in which I had a numinous experience when I was reading Answer to Job online the first time, and because I was recording it, the experience is actually visible on video, which you can find on this YouTube channel. If you go to the home page, and you go down to the place where you see 3 Blue Angels jets in the image. That's the thumbnail for that experience. You'll actually see it come over me and how it affects me as I realize what has happened. And so it all comes down to these 2 paragraphs. And so I'll read them and then I'll come back and talk about them. The conscious realization of what is hidden and kept secret certainly confronts us with an insoluble conflict. At least this is how it appears to the conscious mind. But the symbols that rise up out of the unconscious in dreams show it rather as a confrontation of opposites, and the images of the goal represent their successful reconciliation. Now here's the money lines. Something empirically demonstrable comes to our aid from the depths of our unconscious nature. And that's what that video is. It's empirically demonstrable. I can point you to that video and you can see it physically happen to me in the physical world. Okay, it is the task of the conscious mind to understand these hints. If this does not happen, the process of individuation will nevertheless continue. The only difference is that we become its victims and are dragged along by fate toward that inescapable goal, which we might have reached walking upright if only we had taken the trouble and been patient enough to understand that in time the meaning of the noumena that cross our path. Okay, so that is, he's expressly saying that, you know, you have to have a conscious mind that recognizes the significance of what happened. And so it is part of my individuation. That video is a clear demonstration of a part of my individuation where that event clearly showed me something. And you can look at the pointers to the various timings on the video to see what I said there. Okay, the only thing that really matters now is whether man, humanity, he means, can climb up to a higher moral level, to a higher plane of consciousness, in order to be equal to the superhuman powers which the fallen angels have played into his hands. But he can make no progress with himself unless he becomes very much better acquainted with his own nature. Unfortunately, a terrifying ignorance prevails in this respect, and an equally great aversion to increasing the knowledge of his intrinsic character. I would say that's a direct reference to our former president. However, in the most unexpected quarters nowadays, we find people who can no longer blink the fact that something ought to be done with man in regard to his psychology. Unfortunately, the little word ought tells us that they do not know what to do and do not know the way that leads to the goal. We can, of course, hope for the undeserved grace of God who hears our prayers, but God, who also does not hear our prayers, wants to become man. And for that purpose, he has chosen through the Holy Ghost the creaturely man filled with darkness, the natural man who is tainted with original sin and who learned the divine arts and sciences from the fallen angels. The guilty person is eminently suitable and is therefore chosen to become the vessel for the continuing incarnation, not the guiltless one who holds aloof from the world and refuses to pay his tribute to life. For in that person, the dark God would find no room. Okay, so there's a lot tied up in that. The point is that I can, like a horse, I can bring you to water, but I can't make you drink. And so if you don't get what I'm talking about in these sessions, go back and read them again, listen to them again, because I can't sort of cut off the top of your head and pour in the wisdom. Only you can do that, and you have to take it in and consider it yourself. You can, by looking at my numinous experiences, and I, in another video, the video with the Blue Angels is one, but there's also a video called Finding the Living God. And in that, I give several other examples of numinous experiences I have had. It takes about 45 minutes to get through those examples, but there are quite a number of them in there, so you'll start to see what I'm talking about. And once you do, you'll know. You will have no need to believe, you know. And so let's quickly go back and look at what's being said. Let's see. Okay, I guess there's nothing new. Okay, so okay, so all right, so anyway, Dr. Jung is pointing out that once you recognize your own noumena in your own life, you will know. You don't have to believe any longer. All religions can bring you up to a point, but then it's you that has to step forward, because my wife is a Buddhist teacher, and she did a video on this channel once called The Vanishing Path. And basically what that means, down to its nubs, is that all religions offer a path to knowing God. I'll say it very clearly, knowing God. But they cannot make you know God. They can make you believe. And so you can say, I believe, but once you pass this experience, this numinous experience, then you know God, and you no longer have need to believe. And so the famous video of Dr. Jung being asked, do you now believe in God? He says, he gives a complicated answer, but in the end, he says, I have no need to believe, I know. Okay. And when I saw that the first time, that was a numinous experience for me as well, because I said, oh, I know too. And then it took me 10 years to work out what it is that I know. And that's the only way that I could get there, from seeing him say that, was by being able to connect it up with my own personal experiences. And I wrote a book in 2007. It's on Amazon. It's called Tsunami of Blood. Tsunami of Blood. And on the cover, you will find the symbols of the three Abrahamic religions drawn on a beach. And they are about to be run over on that beach by a large wave of blood. And so that was symbolic of this tsunami that was happening to us in the early 2000s, where all the militarists were trotting out all the weapons and saying, this is what we have to do. We have to, fix all these cultures. And of course, you can't fix a culture. It has to evolve in its own way and it's in its own good time. And so we got, our nose bloody by that, because we didn't fix the Iraqi culture and we didn't fix the Afghanistan culture. We just ended up getting another 5,000 members of our armed forces, men and women, killed. And we didn't change anything. And so we have to be more thoughtful and understand these points. Thank you, Kathy, for your comment. Thank you for chatting, sharing, caring. You're welcome. You're welcome. Okay, so here's the money paragraph that relates to this. The very next paragraph is, since the apocalypse, we now know again that God is not only to be loved, but also to be feared. He fills us with evil as well as good. Otherwise, he would not need to be feared. And because he wants to become man, the uniting of his antinomy must take place in man. This involves man in a new responsibility. He can no longer wriggle out of it on the plea of his littleness or nothingness. For the dark God has slipped the atom bomb and chemical weapons into his hands and given him the power to empty out the apocalyptic vials of wrath on his fellow creatures. Since he has been granted an almost godlike power, he can no longer remain blind and unconscious. He must know something of God's nature and of metaphysical processes if he is to understand himself and thereby achieve gnosis of the divine. Okay. What a powerful paragraph. And so what happened in the video that I was telling you about is I was reading from paragraph 746 at the end, and this is what it says. The guilty man is eminently suitable and therefore chosen to become the vessel for the continuing incarnation, not the guiltless one who holds aloof from the world and refuses to pay his tribute to life, for in him the dark God would find no room. I finished that sentence, and just then a flight of 4 F-18s from the Navy, probably wasn't the Blue Angels, but it was the same type of aircraft as the Blue Angels, flew over my house right at that moment. And it's very apparent on the video, and you see my initial reaction to it. And then over the next 3 or 4 minutes, you see my, that's what this means. And it's an event that I did not plan. I could not have planned it. And it was a message only to me. Only I could have interpreted the way I interpreted it at that moment. But the jets were flying over at the beginning of the Navy football game. That was a Saturday, and the U.S. Naval Academy traditionally gets that flyover every week when they have a home game. It's the home court advantage of the U.S. Navy. So anyway, I found that synchronicity so powerful in my own life, and you can see me react to it and recognize it in the moment. Something empirical, demonstrable comes to our aid from the depths of our unconscious nature. So at that moment, when I was reading those 2 paragraphs, I was surely not thinking of Navy football or anything having to do with the Navy at all, and yet that experience pulled up something that was in my deep unconscious, and was numinous to me, and you can see it right there on the video. So it obviously it won't have the same effect on you that it had on me, because I've lived my life and you've lived yours. But because of my life and that synchronicity, I had that experience. And so this is what Dr. Jung is talking about. And so when you have a very powerful numinous experiences, and I've had many, I have numinous experiences daily, but I have big ones every so often, maybe 1 or 2 a year. And now, because of what I know from Dr. Jung's work, they speak to me very, very loudly. And so, okay, let's go. So it's Yane says, small blessings is to be treasured as the very little light of life, of wanting life. The perception of beauty is universal. And Kathy says, wow, Skip, that's an intense numinous synchronicity. And Danny says, Skip, I would like to know your opinion about this. Have I done something wrong toward Kathy? Just try to be reasonable. To clarify, I meant I just try to be reasonable, wasn't questioning your ability to be reasonable. Haven't noticed you're careful with giving strong opinions, though. Well, it's not for me to decide how Kathy reacted to your statement. I mean, although both of you have been followers of mine for quite a while, I don't know anything really about either of your lives, so I couldn't say whether what you said is reasonable or not to her, and neither can you. And so I think that her reaction was obviously a sore point. You touched on a sore point in her unconscious, and she let you have it. And whether you feel it was deserved or not, I don't know, but from here, it kind of looked like it was deserved, because and so this is what we have to be as human beings. We have to find the places where we touch sore points in the psyche of others, and then we have to find ways to reconcile with those sore points. I guess that's the best I can answer you. You know, it's fine to state a strong opinion, but you have to have an audience that is seaworthy enough to accept you for where you are. Okay, in other words, from Bridget Jones's Diary, another of my favorite movies, Kathy. You know, the message was, I love you just as you are. And so my wife, who as I said, is an all but ordained Buddhist teacher, Tibetan Buddhist teacher. She's not Tibetan Buddhist, but she has been a part of Tibetan Buddhism for 25 years now. She wrote me a book once she wrote me a letter once that she faxed to me because I was traveling overseas. And she said, I found the one book that if I was ever deserted on a desert island, this is the book that I would want to have. And I read that when I was 40,000 feet over the earth, flying between Taipei, Taiwan, and Bangkok, Thailand. And I said, wow, that must be some book. What is the book? And the book was the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, and by Sojo Rinpoche. Now, Sojo Rinpoche was not an ordained monk, but he also taught very extensively. He built a community of around 40,000 people. They bought and built retreat centers in several countries of the world. Unfortunately for his message, he was also a human being and made some mistakes. And so those mistakes were never forgiven or forgotten. He's finally now died. And so, you know, it's the issue of our play from this summer, which is the very top video on the homepage of this YouTube channel. If you haven't watched it, please watch it. Its fundamental question is, can there be reconciliation without forgiveness? And that depends on the two parties involved. Okay, and that's the teaching. And there's another teaching which comes from Judaism, which is Tikkun Olam, which means rebuilding the world. And so we face today, all human beings face today, a shattered world. Our world has been shattered because the great systems that made things work together for the last at least 2,000 years, maybe 3,500 years, are in shards. Okay, and rationalists have destroyed Christianity, basically. They, we call the Renaissance the Enlightenment, but it was actually the Endarkenment, because we let the scientific method cause our beliefs to go away, because rationalists will say, "Oh, well, we've got telescopes that go to the Big Bang, and we have electron microscopes that go to the smallest particle, the Higgs boson, and we find no God." And that's completely missing the point. That's a rationalist scientific perspective, but it's completely missing the point, because it's only looking at this physical universe. But within us here and in the collective unconscious, we have 7.5 billion other universes. All of us carry a universe within us. And if we can't reconcile ourselves with that universe, the one that's inside of us, we're going to destroy ourselves. And we've come very close. We had this man who was our 45th president, who doesn't have a clue about any of this. And he came into power saying, well, why can't we use nuclear weapons? Let's just use them. Why can't we just use them against Iran or whatever? Well, you can't, and there are lots of reasons. And people who have spent 20, 30, 40 years defending the nation have enough experience so they know how to calm things down when they get out of hand. But you have someone who comes in with a childlike perspective, and he's able to convince lots of other people who don't have a proper perspective, a needed perspective. And so the result is that we come close to destroying everything that we've had. I mean, that's what the death of Queen Elizabeth represents. And we're going to see if just to cover the bigs, we're going to see if Canada, Australia, and New Zealand have enough wisdom to remain in the Commonwealth and to point to the symbol of the British monarchy for their heads of state. If they have that wisdom, then they have a unifying figure within their country, whether or not they agree with one another politically. But if they don't have that unifying symbol, God knows what will happen in those countries and in those societies and so on. I couldn't say. They're having enough problems. Canada's having enough problems coping with their First Nation people, and there has to be reconciliation. So this Jewish idea of tikkun olam, of rebuilding the world, is exactly what the Pope was doing when he went to Canada recently, a month ago. He wasn't going around making a big show with the politicians in Canada. He was humbly trying to start the process of reconciliation with the First Nations. That's what he was doing. And that's what we all must do, where we've hurt people, where we've hurt loved ones, or whatever it may be. We need to go back and reconcile those. And, that's what the 12-step programs are about. Alcoholics Anonymous and all the others, where And they all point back, which was a surprise to Dr. Jung in 1960, but nonetheless, they all point back to something that Dr. Jung said to Roland H. Before the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous and Bill, Alcoholics Anonymous. All 12-step programs don't refer to one another as by their family name. Bill W. Understood what the message was when he heard it from Roland, and he was able to turn it into a worldwide operation now, but that entirely one of the 12 steps is going and making reconciliation with the people you've hurt. I'm reconciling with my grandfather, who was an alcoholic now, in the spiritual world, because he died the day I was being married the first time in 1968. And I always thought that he was like Willie Loman, but I have been rehabilitating him in my life by kind of doing a reverse 12 steps with him in my psyche. And it's working. I have new respect for the man and what he encountered during his lifetime. I mean, it wasn't easy for Dr. Jung or anyone that went through both world wars and the Great Depression. That was not easy at all. And the reason we're even having this conversation is because of something he did, which was to get my father into the Naval Academy. And so he spent 3 years of World War II at the Naval Academy instead of out on a ship in harm's way. I obviously am attracted to that. I still live 2 miles from the Naval Academy, and to this day. And so it's just, very surprising what happens. I mean, be careful what you wish for. For example, we're having this conversation today because during the Spanish flu of 1918, 104 years ago, my grandfather's fiance and her 4 sisters all died on the same weekend because of the Spanish flu in 1918. All 5 of them, 5 women from one family died. Therefore, a couple of years later, my grandfather married my grandmother. And so I could exist. And so, I am fastidious about getting my flu shots, but I'm descended from a situation where flu made my life possible. So what to wish for in that case? It's hard to know. Let's see. And so Danny says, me and Dad used to have nasty arguments sometimes, but then he would come to me to talk about football like nothing happened. That was one thing I liked about Dad. Well, for my dad, after I was in the 8th grade, he never physically tried to correct me, but he certainly talked to me about things that had gone wrong. And so as a result, I have tremendous respect for him. And Kathy says, that's beautiful ancestral work, Skip. I have been doing some of that as well. It's a magical, rewarding process. Yes, it surely is. And I've been rehabilitating my maternal grandfather, the one whose fiance was died of the flu, because he lived in my household for 8 years after my grandmother died. And he and I were like oil and water. He was the most bigoted person I ever knew, and still is that. I mean, he didn't like anybody that wasn't, lily white and Christian. He was a 32nd degree or 33rd degree Mason, the top of the Masonic order, and he was extremely bigoted. And I became sort of his doppelganger, his opposite. So, with the exception of one person I know, I'm the most liberal person I've ever known. And that says a lot. And, my wife, when I wrote Tsunami of Blood, my wife read it, and I made references to God a number of times in that book. It was published in 2007. And she came to me after reading it, and she said, I was surprised at how often you mentioned God in your book, because she and I do not go to church. The only times we go to church are with her mother for candlelight service on Christmas, and very occasionally I will go to the Naval Academy chapel for Easter Sunday. I've grown away from Navy chapels because the chaplain corps has been taken over by fundamentalists who are very often spewing hateful remarks and uncalled for remarks about other groups, not only foreign enemies, but also people who don't believe as they believe. And so nowadays they've driven me away from the chapel, and I can only go over there when I know there's no service going on, because otherwise they make me so angry that I just can't deal with it. So I don't, because I can't fix the chaplain corps. It's the chaplain corps that has to realize that they have a problem and fix it for themselves. But anyway, okay, so I've given a 2-hour soliloquy here, and we've gotten through 3 paragraphs of Answer to Job. We have 11 more paragraphs to go. I don't know how long it will take us to get through them, because each one of them is jam-packed with stuff that can be very controversial. Next week, I hope to get through Dr. Jung's reference to the Assumption of the Virgin Mary into heaven, which is the papal bull of 1950. And Dr. Jung considered that the most important religious document since the Reformation, since Martin Luther. So, and that was Pope Pius XII's papal bull called The Assumption of the Virgin Mary into Heaven. And this is a very significant event for us next year on the 13th to 16th of October of 13 to 16 October 2023 at Mount Madonna Retreat Center, which is in California. We will be holding another confluence. It's about exactly 1 year from now. We'll be right in the middle of it. And the topic of that confluence will be the emergence of the feminine. We're working very hard on that and how to present it. Obviously, the feminine principle has been becoming stronger for thousands of years. Obviously, it's pretty well known that humans had a matriarchal culture before 8,000 years ago, and this is reflected in the Venus of Willendorf and many other works of art. But about 8,000 years ago, I suppose, culture started to become patriarchal, and I believe that that had to do with the fact that our culture started to bump up against one another, and there started to be competition for space. And so, male rationalism started to come to the fore, and the matriarchal culture was pushed out. But nonetheless, it's always been recognized. It was recognized pre-Christ in Proverbs 8. So if you don't know Proverbs 8, I urge you to go get your Bible and read Proverbs 8. And so obviously the Virgin Mary has become more and more important, especially in the Catholic Church. And the church finally had to recognize that most Catholics were praying the rosary and referring to Mary. And so they had to recognize that finally, after it took 1,000 years for the church fathers to get it. And so finally in 1950, Pope Pius allowed that Mary was in the heavenly court, and so she becomes Sophia, the consort of the Godhead, the feminine part of the Godhead, and later she becomes the mother of Jesus Christ, and so the feminine became a metaphysical thing, even in the Catholic Church, which took a long while to get through. And people picked up on what Dr. Jung was saying in the 1960s, and they sort of went out on this crazy binge that resulted in Woodstock and other events and that sort of thing. And the stage show Hair, for example, pointing to astrological signs, which we ourselves do point to, because now humanity has a new way of thinking about what's going on. And Sophia in Proverbs 8, in most Bibles, I think the patriarchs have changed the word Sophia to read wisdom. Okay, but it's quite obvious even in those Bibles that wisdom has a feminine being. In some Bibles, it does say Sophia, I Sophia, wisdom. But in any case, from an astrological point of view, that was sort of a rough beginning. The 60s were a rough beginning to the age of Aquarius, and so now we're looking for the true meaning, and I'm going to share the image that we've adopted into our hearts now, because we created it for our confluence in 2022, and the upper figure here is Sophia pouring wisdom into the bowl of the adolescent humanity. And this statuette we've made into an award. I was blessed to receive the 5th example of this award. But it's represents people who are carrying wisdom with them so that they can share it with others. And so that is the essence of the age of Aquarius. It's a reference to the constellation in the physical constellation world, but it's also a reference to the constellation that exists in all of our psyches, and that is the receiving of wisdom from ancient days, and that at least Jews see that as coming from humans, and or from the feminine. And in the Christian era, the church has conflated the feminine principle by saying that Christ is androgynous. Well, no, I think that Christ was a physical man. He wasn't androgynous, but nonetheless, that's what the church does in the way that it refers to Christ, and it doesn't. The church didn't want to admit that it was actually coming from a physical woman, or the actual feminine principle, until 1950, and it is in that it's in that papal bull of 1950 where the church recognizes that the Virgin Mary went to heaven, and sits in the heavenly court. Okay, let's see. Thank you, Kathy, for your comment. And Danny says, I guess it's not controversial to say that the Vatican has enormous wealth and their Christ says the rich should give to the poor, so it would be fair to take most of their wealth to give it to poor people. Well, the Vatican is a symbol of a lot of black power, dark power, besides the power of light. And, we'll see whether the church can come to terms with its darkness. Obviously, it's been struggling with that, especially in the early 21st century, with the spotlight and various other things. They need to go a fair bit further. They need to, lighten up on LGBTQ, and they have to start allowing their clergy to marry. And then they will really understand their own papal bull of 1950. But until that happens, we have to bump along. Kathy says, I love the water bear. I'm so touched and pleased that you have been a recipient. That's so special. Yes, it surely is special. And as you probably know, and I'll put it in the description of this session, so I'm sure that you all have it. We are trying to raise money to be able to give more of them. We especially want to give them, although Jungian analysts are in the list, we especially want to give them to individuals who've made a contribution to what Dr. Jung was driving at. And also, I think from an astrology point of view, the astrology organizations too could turn it into an award for astrologers, especially astrologers who know something about the Aquarian age. And I think that will come. As of now, there are only 7 of these statues in existence, and they're all either given or called for. But the artist, Tim Holmes, and the reason for that is that unfortunately, because Tim Holmes's foundry shut down, we only have 7, but he has found a new foundry and he is going to be producing more. The ultimate series for this particular sculpture is 45. There won't be more than 45 made. And so, as I say, the first 7 have been committed. I have ideas for another 4 myself, but I have insufficient money myself to acquire them and make those gifts to people. So we're looking for nominations of people who have made true big contributions to this idea of the water bearer and the idea of wisdom coming down into adolescent humanity, however that's done. Also to astrologers who understand the meaning of the Aquarian age. And so we're gradually growing up. That was the message of the last 3 paragraphs that I've read today. And it was Dr. Jung's message to us to grow up. So I hope that's meaningful and useful to you all. Let's talk about it some more next week. We still have 11 paragraphs to go, and they're full of interesting advice. So peace. Oh, if you're, we're going to have a very, very powerful session this afternoon on this book, Reflections of a Passerby, subtitled Jesus, Jung, and the Power of Choice. That session is at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, 6 p.m. Central Time, 5 p.m. Mountain Time, and 4 p.m. California time. And I urge you to attend. It will ultimately be on YouTube, but if you want to participate live and ask questions of the author, whose name is Eleanor Norris, Dr. Eleanor Norris, please attend that session with us. It will only be on Zoom this afternoon. We may have to edit some parts of the video because we'll have some time before the beginning of that to get organized and that sort of thing. So we'll have to chop that part off. But anyway, we'll be beginning at that time, 4 p.m. California time, 7 p.m. Eastern time. And that will be a live session on Zoom only. So I hope you join us. I think I put it in the announcement for today's panel, and I will be sending out the links for it again this afternoon. So let me just, I'm going to give you our MailChimp link here at the bottom of the chat. And it is here. That's our new MailChimp link. And so if you register for Wisdom Path on that link, it's free of charge. If you register for Wisdom Path, you will receive the notice that I send out this afternoon. So just so you know where you can get it if you're signed up. And you can, even if you're not sure if you signed up, you can go to that link and just click on Wisdom Path, and it won't add you to the list a second time if you're already there. So just make sure you've registered for Wisdom Path, and you'll receive the notice once again this afternoon. But you have to sign up before I send out that notice, which is going to be in about 2 hours time. Well, no, I guess it'll be about 4 hours time for me. I have to always think about what time zone I'm in. So peace. Thank you for coming today. And thank you, Danny and Kathy, for sharing your observations today. I really appreciate it. And